Hello everyone and welcome to this new session in which we'll treat model versioning with WandB. Now, in the previous session, we had looked at dataset versioning, in which we had created an augmented version of our data, which happens to be this version right here from previous versions, like a preprocessed version, another preprocessed version, and the original data. And so from here, we are now gonna see how to implement model versioning using this augmented data and the untrained model version. So we have this version of the model which is untrained and the augmented data which are going to be passed in this run to produce our trained model version. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button so you never miss amazing content like this. In the previous session, we saw how to implement dataset versioning with WandB artifacts. We left from this original raw data right here onto this pre-processed data. We created the trained validation and test sets, and then finally we had this augmented data right here. And now we are gonna see how to make use of this augmented data in training our model. But while training this model, we are gonna implement model versioning. And the two model versions we'll have here will be the model before training and the model after training. And so we're making use of this sequential model which we had created previously. And the good news here is the way we implement model versioning is quite similar to the way we implement dataset versioning. We'll start by copying out this code and then we'll simply modify that. In here we have this WandB model versioning. Let's paste that out. And then here, instead of augment data, we are gonna log our model. So here we have log model, which is in fact this Lunette model right here. We have the log model, WandB needs our project entity specified. The artifacts to be used here is known, so we're not gonna make use of any artifact to lock this model artifact right here. And so with that, we have this, take off this augmented data, we have our model, let's call it model or untrained model, and then we specify that it is this untrained model, it's of type model, so we have that type model, the initial version of our Lunette model. There we go. Now we have that done. This artifact file here, we're not going to make use of this. We're not making use of any previous artifacts. We just log in this model initially, and then here we'll take this off. We're not going to make use of this. Just before writing in our model, we're gonna save that model. So here we have this model to be saved. We call it's our Lunette model actually. So we have Lunette model.save, and then we'll give it a file name. So let's call it Lunette.h5, and that's it. So we've saved this model. Let's have this file name to be Lunette.h5. So let's define this Lunette.h5 file here and take this off. So we have now our file name. Now, since we've already saved this file, instead of going through this process here of creating a new file and all of that, we're just gonna add a file. So here we have our untrained model.add file, and then we'll specify the file name. So that's all we need to do. And then we're gonna also do WandB.save that file based on the file name. And that's it. So let's take off this part here, and then we're gonna log our artifact, which happens to be our untrained model. So we have your untrained model, and that's fine. Now we could add in some metadata. So let's have metadata, which is equals our configuration, which we've defined already. In here, let's modify this name. This is our untrained model. So here's untrained model, and that's fine. So with this, we could now run this here. With this successful run right here, and then we could now go back to WandB. Getting back here, we have this under our artifacts, we have the model. So here we could click on this model, and then we'll specify the untrained model. So let's click on this, and we have this overview. You see we have that API metadata. You see the metadata we've logged in. We have the files. You see the Linnet model, and then we have, as usual, our graph view, which we could explode. Notice that it's quite simple because for now it isn't linked to our data set. So all we have is just this run, which produces this untrained model or this initialized model. From this point, we'll go ahead to train our model and log that trained version of the model. So again, here we have this artifact which we are going to use in training the model, which happens to be our augmented data set. Recall that we had logged this augmented data previously. You could have this overview from here. We have this augmented data set, and then it's of type preprocessed data. We've seen that already. We download the data, and then we create this new artifact, which is going to be our trained sequential model. We call this trained sequential model. It's of type model, description, a trained version of our model. Simple as that. So that's it. We could also pass in the metadata, just as we had seen here with this log model, where we pass in the configuration. So metadata equals our configuration, and that's fine. Getting back to this augment data method we have seen previously, we're going to follow this same pattern. That is, we're going to download the data as we've done already. We download the data, and then we have this artifact file. Here, the artifact file we're using was a trained data set because we needed to take this and convert it into an augmented data set. And then we had this processing right here to produce dataset X and dataset Y. Now we're going to do this exact procedure for training our data on the augmented data. So let's paste this out right here, and then here our artifact file will be this arg data set. So here we have arg data set, and we get this right from here. Let's get back to arg data set files, and there we go. You see we have this arg data set.npz, which we had stored previously. And so once we are going to download this, we're going to have this file, which is going to be found in this folder, which is also found in this artifacts folder. So we have artifacts augmented dataset version 0, which is from this. This means that if we want to use the version 1, we just simply have to specify your version 1 and so on and so forth. So that said, we have our artifact file, dataset, and then we go through this processing to obtain dataset X and dataset Y. And then from here, we'll go through this series of steps to convert this data into a TensorFlow dataset type data. So here we have dx, dy. This dataset X we convert to tensor. So we convert this dataset X to a tensor and dataset Y to a tensor. And then from here, we apply this from tensor slices method, which takes in dx and dy. That's our dataset X and our dataset Y to create this new dataset D. Now we go through the same procedures we have seen already. That's we shuffle, we batch, we prefetch, and then we have our training data set. Now note that you could repeat the same process for the validation, but here we'll just do this for the training, and you could take it as an exercise to do the same for the validation. Note that for validation, we didn't make use of the augmented data set. We instead made use of the validation data set itself. Let's get to the graph view so you could see that clearer. And as you could see here, we have this data which is preprocessed data, the trained data set, preprocessed data, the validation data set, preprocessed data, test data set. And then from here we had the augmented data, which is this one. And so when you want to carry out validation, you're not going to be making use of this training data, obviously. So we're going to make use of this one instead. And so if you are to put in the validation in here, that's convert the validation data into a TensorFlow dataset type data, and then use it for training and evaluation, then you would have to make sure you modify this here. So that said, we continue with this process. We have the trained data, which we just created. It's now a TensorFlow dataset type data, and so training can now go on smoothly. So you see here we have the metrics. We've used to seeing this already, compiling, and then we feed the model. So here we are not going to include the validation. We have that ready. We're going to do the training, and after training our model, we would have this. So let's simply just have that LearnNet model.fit, and then after this we'll have similar to what we had seen already here in this log model method, the file which has been saved and then saved to WandB, and then the artifact which has been logged. So let's copy this out and then get back here and paste this. Now let's change this name. Let's say LearnNet trained. LearnNet trained, that's our file name. Untrained model.add file. It's actually, here we have this trained sequential model. So let's have this as trained sequential model. There we go. We have the trained sequential model.add file name, WandB save file name, run the log artifact, the trained sequential model. Okay, so that's it. So we have this set. We could now run this method and then see what we get. We obtain this error where we've been told the name LearnNet model isn't defined. Now, as you had seen previously with this log model method, we made use of the LearnNet model which we had defined right here. So we defined this LearnNet model as this using the sequential API, and that's what we had. And this led us to having this here where we had a run. So initially we had this run which produced our untrained model. So we have this here untrained model. Let's call it untrained model. And since in our case we're trying to build our trained model, it's gonna be reasonable for us to make use of this untrained model which we've stored already in WandB, since we're doing model versioning. And so instead of us making use of this LearnNet model, we are going to make use of this version of the untrained model which was stored already in WandB. So from here we're going to run another process which now will lead us to this trained model. But then to run this process we will also need data. So as you could see, you have the data, that's our augmented data. From here we have the trained data. We have different other nodes which came before this. So recall all what we've seen before, having the untrained, the augmented data, which is this one here, and then this augmented data together with this untrained model will produce our trained model. And once we have this trained model, we can now use it for prediction. And so coming back again, if we had to use this LearnNet model which was defined here in the notebook, would have this data set that will have our data which will pass into the run, and then would have our outputted trained model. And then on the other side we'll just have this outputted, like we have this run, and then we have this outputted untrained model. So we'll have the untrained model and the trained model which would exist like two separate entities in our global graph, whereas what we want to do is to be able to link this two up. And so that's why we are not going to make use of this LearnNet model which was defined here, and this is why we're going to make use of the model which has already been stored in WandB. That said, getting back to the code, we're going to copy this out here, and then in the place of this LearnNet model, as instead of using the LearnNet model we've defined here, we are now going to make use of our artifact which we've stored already. So let's have this here. So let's have that pasted here, and then we'll make use of this artifact which is in fact called the untrained model. So you see we have this here. Let's copy this out. We copy that out, and then we paste this here. Let's paste this here, and there we go. Just after downloading the model, the next step will be to have this artifact file, which is simply our untrained model which we should have downloaded. So in that case, we're gonna have this here artifacts, start in the artifacts directory, artifacts, and then in here we take this out from here. Let's copy this and paste out here our untrained model, and then to be more specific, we could get the file name from here. So here you see we have the file name. You could get back here, overview, and then you have files LearnNet h5. So this is a file we're going to download, and here is it here. So we have that. So now we have the artifact file which we want to download. We have this path, and then now we could make use of TensorFlow's load model method. So here we have now Lunet model, which is equal tf.keras models and load model, which takes in the artifact file. There we go. So now we have this Lunet model, which is not gotten from this definition here, but which is gotten from a previous version of our model, which has been stored in WandB. So let's now run this and see what we get. After training for over 3 epochs, here are the results we get. And then we get to WandB. You see here we have the model, trained sequential model, and then the untrained model. So let's click on this trained sequential model, loading artifacts. There we go. We could look at this API metadata, which we loaded, and the file. So here we have Lunet trained, and then we also have our graph view. Exploding this view, here's what we get. Now let's focus on this part here. And as you can see, we have this run, which produces this untrained model here. We have this untrained model, and then this untrained model together with our augmented data set being passed through this run now produce our trained sequential model. And that's it for the section in which we've seen how to implement model versioning with WandB. Thanks for getting right up to this point, and see you next time.